Breaking news out of Ottawa, Canada. The Trump administration has just demanded a staggering $620 billion long-term aluminum supply agreement from Canada, and what happened next is sending shockwaves through global trade markets. We're talking about the world's fourth largest aluminum producer making a calculated move that could fundamentally reshape North American trade relationships for the next generation. Canadian producers are pivoting to European markets at a pace that's catching Washington completely off guard, and American manufacturers are about to pay the price in ways that'll hit your wallet harder than you think. In the next 11 minutes, I'm going to break down exactly how this aluminum standoff threatens $23 billion in annual U.S. manufacturing output, why Canada's European pivot is already securing contracts worth $87 billion over the next decade, and which American industries are about to face crippling supply shortages that could force production shutdowns within 6 months. Here's the question nobody in Washington wants to answer. What happens when America's closest trading partner decides the risk of doing business with an unpredictable administration simply isn't worth it anymore? Let me paint you the picture. On January 18, 2025, Trump administration Trade Representative Sarah Marchetti delivered an ultimatum to Canadian aluminum producers during a closed-door meeting in Washington. According to documents obtained by the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the demand included fixed pricing structures 28% below current market rates, guaranteed supply commitments extending through 2045, and penalty clauses that would effectively transfer massive financial risk entirely onto Canadian producers. On January 20th, just 48 hours later, Rio Tinto Alcan announced a preliminary framework agreement with the European Aluminum Association worth $42 billion over 7 years. By January 22nd, Alcoa's Canadian division had confirmed exploratory talks with German automotive manufacturers for dedicated supply chains bypassing U.S. intermediaries entirely. Then, on January 23rd, the Aluminum Association of Canada released internal projections showing European contract values could reach $87 billion by 2035 if current negotiation trajectories hold. The Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago published an emergency analysis on January 24th, warning that American aluminum-dependent industries, from automotive to aerospace to construction, face potential supply disruptions that could cascade through supply chains affecting 4.2 million jobs. The Yale Budget Lab released supplementary research the same day quantifying potential GDP impact at $134 billion if Canadian aluminum exports to the U.S. decline by just 30% over the next 18 months. What we're witnessing right now is the unraveling of a 70-year trade relationship built on geographic proximity, integrated supply chains, and mutual economic benefit, all because one administration decided to treat America's most reliable trading partner like a hostile negotiating opponent. So how exactly does this work? Think of it like this. Imagine you've been buying high-quality ingredients from your next-door neighbor's farm for decades, paying fair market prices, and both of you prosper from the arrangement. Then one day you demand they sell to you at prices that barely cover their costs, lock them into contracts that transfer all financial risk to them, and threaten penalties if they don't comply. Your neighbor looks across town and realizes there's an entire community of buyers willing to pay fair prices, offer balanced risk sharing, and treat them with respect. That's precisely what's happening with Canadian aluminum and European markets. Canada produces approximately 3.1 million metric tons of primary aluminum annually, making it the world's fourth largest producer behind China, India, and Russia. Historically, 71% of Canadian aluminum exports went to the United States because of NAFTA provisions, geographic proximity reducing transportation costs, and deeply integrated manufacturing supply chains. The Trump demand attempts to leverage this dependency, assuming Canada has no viable alternatives. But here's what the administration miscalculated. European aluminum demand is surging due to aggressive electric vehicle manufacturing expansion, renewable energy infrastructure requiring massive amounts of aluminum for wind turbines and solar panel frames, and deliberate efforts to diversify away from Chinese supply chains following pandemic-era disruptions. According to the European Aluminum Association, EU demand is projected to increase by 4.8 million metric tons annually by 2030. and current European production capacity can only meet 62% of that demand. Canadian aluminum is premium quality, produced using 97% hydroelectric power, making it among the lowest carbon footprint aluminum in the world, exactly what European manufacturers need to meet strict environmental regulations. The economics are straightforward. Canadian producers can sell to Europeans at market rates averaging $3,200 per metric ton, or accept Trump's demanded rate of approximately $2,300 per metric ton with massive contractual risk. Transportation costs to European ports add roughly $400 per metric ton, still leaving Canadian producers with significantly better margins and far less political risk than locking into punitive U.S. contracts extending 2 decades. And it gets worse. Let me introduce you to Michael Patterson, a 53-year-old plant manager at Premier Automotive Components in Toledo, Ohio. Michael's facility manufactures precision aluminum engine blocks for Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis, employing 470 workers in a community where his plant represents the largest private employer. Michael's operation depends entirely on Canadian aluminum meeting exacting specifications for strength, weight, and machinability. On January 21st, Michael received notification from his primary Canadian supplier, a partnership that's endured for 19 years, that contract renewal terms would include 23% price increases and shortened commitment windows from annual contracts to quarterly agreements. Michael ran the numbers. A 23% aluminum cost increase translates to a 14% increase in his overall production costs. His automotive clients operate on contracts with profit margins averaging 6.2%. Michael cannot absorb a 14% cost increase. He cannot pass it to his clients who will simply source from Mexican or overseas suppliers. Michael faces an impossible choice: accept financially unsustainable contracts that will bleed his operation into bankruptcy within 18 months, or begin painful workforce reductions starting with 75 layoffs by April 2025. Michael told his leadership team last week that he's looked at every option and sees no path forward that doesn't end with either closing the facility or selling to a private equity firm that'll gut the workforce and move production overseas. Multiply Michael's story by 437 similar facilities across the American manufacturing belt, and you're looking at a cascading crisis that'll devastate communities already struggling with manufacturing decline. Let me introduce you to Jennifer Okafor, a 41-year-old aerospace engineer at Lockheed Martin's facility in Fort Worth, Texas. Jennifer's team designs next-generation fighter aircraft components where aluminum alloys meeting military specifications are absolutely non-negotiable. These aren't commercial-grade materials. We're talking about aluminum alloys that must perform flawlessly at 60,000 feet altitude, withstand temperature variations from -80 to +200 degrees Fahrenheit, and meet fatigue-resistant standards certified through years of testing. Canadian producers have supplied these specialized alloys to U.S. aerospace manufacturers for decades because they've invested in the precise production capabilities, quality control systems, and security clearances required for defense applications. On January 22nd, Jennifer's procurement team received preliminary warnings that Canadian suppliers are prioritizing European aerospace contracts, including agreements with Airbus, Dassault Aviation, and BAE Systems, because those contracts offer better terms and don't carry the political risk of sudden tariff impositions or contract renegotiations demanded by unpredictable U.S. policy shifts. Jennifer's team analyzed the situation, and the conclusion is devastating. If Canadian aerospace-grade aluminum supplies decline by even 20%, her facility faces production delays on the F-35 program that could cost Lockheed Martin $1.6 billion in penalty clauses and compromised delivery schedules to allied nations already frustrated by years of delays. Jennifer's personal nightmare. She's leading a team of 73 engineers, many of whom relocated from across the country specifically for this program, and she may have to tell them by summer that their projects are indefinitely delayed because the administration picked a trade fight with America's most reliable supplier of critical materials. The stress is eating her alive because everyone on her team knows these problems are entirely self-inflicted and completely avoidable. But here's the kicker. Let me introduce you to Robert Chen, a 37-year-old construction company owner in Phoenix, Arizona. Robert's company specializes in commercial building projects where aluminum is fundamental for window frames, curtain wall systems, roofing materials, and structural components. Arizona's construction boom, driven by population growth and data center construction, has made Robert's business incredibly profitable over the past 5 years. He employs 96 workers directly and supports another 200 jobs through subcontractors and suppliers. On January 20th, Robert's aluminum suppliers notified him that prices for construction-grade aluminum are increasing 31% effective March 1st, and supply allocations are being reduced by 40% due to Canadian suppliers prioritizing higher-margin industrial clients and European contracts. Robert has 7 active projects with fixed-price contracts totaling $83 million. He purchased aluminum futures to hedge against price increases, but those contracts only covered 60% of his projected needs, and they expire in April. The 31% price increase on his remaining aluminum requirements will cost Robert's company approximately $4.9 million that he simply doesn't have. His options are brutal. Attempt to renegotiate fixed-price contracts with clients who'll likely sue him for breach of contract, absorb losses that'll bankrupt his company by third quarter 2025, or halt projects leaving 238 workers unemployed and clients with half-finished buildings. Robert met with his attorney and accountant on January 23rd, and both told him the same thing. He's facing business failure through no fault of his own, entirely because government trade policy created artificial scarcity in a market that functioned perfectly well for decades. Robert's father built this company over 32 years. Robert is watching it collapse in 32 days. According to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, if Canadian aluminum exports to the United States decline by 30% over the next 12 months, American manufacturing output will contract by $23 billion annually. The Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago warns that cascading supply chain disruptions could affect 4.2 million jobs across automotive, aerospace, construction, packaging, and consumer goods industries. The Aluminum Association released analysis on January 23rd showing that American aluminum production capacity can only replace 18% of potential Canadian supply reductions, and ramping up domestic production would require capital investments exceeding $47 billion and timeline extending 5 to 7 years. The Yale Budget Lab quantifies total economic impact at $134 billion when accounting for reduced manufacturing output, supply chain disruptions, and lost productivity. Let me be crystal clear. Experts at the Council on Foreign Relations warn that the next 30 to 90 days represent a critical window where Canadian producers are finalizing European contracts that'll lock in supply commitments extending through 2035. In the 6 to 12-month timeframe, American manufacturers will begin experiencing acute shortages, forcing production cuts, facility closures, and permanent workforce reductions. But here's what really concerns analysts: the permanent damage to trade relationships and supply chain integration. According to the Brookings Institution, once Canadian producers successfully pivot to European markets and establish new supply chains, transportation infrastructure, and business relationships, the economic incentive to prioritize the American market disappears even if future administrations attempt to repair the relationship. We're not talking about temporary disruptions that'll resolve with better negotiating. We're talking about fundamental restructuring of North American trade flows that'll disadvantage American manufacturers for a generation. Deutsche Bank analysis, published January 24th, projects that European aluminum supply chains will be substantially locked in by fourth quarter 2025, meaning American manufacturers will face permanently higher costs, reduced supply security, and competitive disadvantages that'll accelerate the offshoring of manufacturing to markets with better access to aluminum supplies. And it gets worse. The German Association of the Automotive Industry announced on January 23rd that major manufacturers including Volkswagen, BMW, and Mercedes-Benz are finalizing agreements with Canadian aluminum producers for dedicated supply chains supporting electric vehicle production through 2040. These contracts specifically include environmental certifications documenting the low carbon footprint of hydroelectric-powered Canadian aluminum production, critical for meeting EU sustainability regulations. Simultaneously, the European Aluminium Association released projections showing that Canadian aluminum could capture 23% of EU import markets by 2030, displacing supplies from Russia and China that European manufacturers are deliberately diversifying away from for geopolitical and environmental reasons. Meanwhile, American aluminum consumers face a perfect storm. Domestic production insufficient to replace Canadian imports, alternative suppliers like Australia and Norway already operating at near full capacity with limited ability to increase exports to the US, and Chinese aluminum carrying tariffs that make it economically unviable even before considering quality and environmental concerns. The National Association of Manufacturers released an emergency brief on January 24th, warning that industries dependent on aluminum face the most severe supply crisis since the 1970s oil shocks, with potentially devastating consequences for American manufacturing competitiveness, employment, and economic growth. Industry analysts at Morgan Stanley project that if current trajectories continue, American automotive manufacturers alone could face production losses exceeding $17 billion in 2026. Aerospace manufacturers could experience program delays costing $9.4 billion in penalties and lost contracts, and construction sectors could see project cancellations exceeding $53 billion as aluminum costs and availability make projects financially unviable. Let me be crystal clear about the timeline. Right now, in the past 48 hours, Canadian aluminum producers are signing preliminary agreements with European buyers that'll fundamentally reshape their export priorities. Just this week, Rio Tinto Alcan confirmed framework agreements worth $42 billion over 7 years with European manufacturers. As we speak, American manufacturers are receiving contract renewal notices with price increases averaging 23 to 31% and reduced supply commitments that'll force impossible choices within weeks. The data shows that this isn't a negotiating tactic or temporary market adjustment. This is a strategic pivot by Canadian producers who've concluded that European markets offer better economics and dramatically less political risk than continuing to prioritize an American market where government policy can upend contracts and impose arbitrary demands without warning. According to trade economists at the University of Michigan, the Trump administration's aluminum demands represent a catastrophic misunderstanding of modern global supply chains, where suppliers have options and buyers who abuse market position quickly find themselves without reliable partners. The Atlantic Council published analysis on January 24th, documenting how this aluminum standoff mirrors broader patterns, where the administration's confrontational trade approach is actively driving allied nations to diversify away from American markets, weakening U.S. economic leverage, and creating lasting competitive disadvantages for American industries. Let's recap the 3 critical points. First, who pays? It's not Canadian aluminum producers facing consequences from Trump's demands. It's Michael Patterson watching his automotive plant in Toledo face closure, Jennifer Okafor seeing her aerospace team's projects jeopardized, Robert Chen watching his Phoenix construction company collapse into bankruptcy, and 4.2 million American workers across manufacturing sectors facing job losses and wage cuts as their employers struggle with aluminum shortages and skyrocketing costs. Second, the scale with numbers. We're talking about Canadian aluminum exports worth $23 billion annually to the U.S., potentially declining by 30%. European contracts valued at $87 billion through 2035, locking in Canadian supply commitments. And total American economic impact, reaching $134 billion when accounting for cascading supply chain disruptions across automotive, aerospace, construction, and consumer goods industries. Third, the permanent consequence. Once Canadian producers successfully establish European supply chains and business relationships, the economic incentive to prioritize the American market disappears even under future administrations, meaning American manufacturers face permanently higher aluminum costs, reduced supply security, and competitive disadvantages that'll accelerate manufacturing decline for a generation. If this analysis provided value, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with anyone who needs to understand how trade policy directly impacts American jobs and economic competitiveness. Your support helps create content examining the real consequences of political decisions on working Americans. Here's what keeps me up at night. We're watching in real time as American trade policy actively destroys the competitive advantages that made U.S. manufacturing globally successful for decades. Geographic proximity to Canadian aluminum supplies, integrated supply chains built over 70 years, and reliable trade relationships that allowed American manufacturers to compete globally are being sacrificed for short-term political posturing that fundamentally misunderstands how modern global trade actually works. The Trump administration demanded a $620 billion aluminum deal, expecting Canada to capitulate because of historical dependence on American markets, but instead they're discovering that in 2025, suppliers have options and countries treated as adversaries rather than partners will simply take their business elsewhere. The tragic irony is that American manufacturers, workers, and communities will pay the price for years, while Canadian aluminum producers thrive serving European markets, eager for reliable, environmentally responsible suppliers. This isn't winning. This is systematically dismantling American industrial competitiveness, one short-sighted trade demand at a time. And by the time the consequences become undeniable, the damage will be permanent and irreversible.